Hi guys, today we're going to jump right back into our lecture on the chapter in your book which talks about the processes of evolution. I want to backtrack for just a second to remind you that we're talking about the 5 processes of evolutionary change as outlined in your book. And what we mean by evolutionary change here is changes in the frequency of alleles within a particular gene pool or within a population. So these are things that lead to changes in allele frequency within a population and therefore contribute to evolutionary change. What you may have already picked up on is these processes really lead or are part of what we would probably call microevolution. So they're small changes within a kind, they don't contribute directly to organisms or populations changing from one kind to another. They are mechanisms for change within a population where that population doesn't change from one kind to another. So these are microevolutionary changes that a macroevolutionist would tell you could lead to big changes from one kind to another given enough time. All right, so we've already talked about mutation. How do mutations change the frequency of alleles? Well, mutations can lead to whole new alleles being present, and then when selection acts on those new mutations, those new alleles, you may see a change in allele frequency. Selection is what we just talked about when certain traits within a population are favored over other traits, either artificially or naturally. If we're talking about a trait that's favored, that evolves through natural selection, we call that an adaptation. So those can lead to changes in allele frequency because certain alleles will be eliminated from the population if they make the organism less fit for survival in a particular situation, and other alleles will increase in a population if those alleles are adaptations of their favored traits. Okay, gene flow is another way in which allele frequencies can change within a population. And let me check my time here. And gene flow is simply the migration of individuals or the movement of gametes, like in the case of pollen, between populations. So you can be introducing new alleles into a population if this happens. Conversely, if you keep 2 populations separated and there is no gene flow, then these populations could diverse and become separate species. So gene flow is one way you can change the frequency of alleles within a population because it allows for new alleles to be introduced into the population when a new individual moves in through migration, or like for example the gametes in pollen are introduced to a different population. Okay, genetic drift is another mechanism of evolutionary change, and genetic drift happens when you have a random loss of individuals from a population, and therefore you have a random loss of alleles from the population. It's nothing to do with fitness. It can be some sort of catastrophic event, but it has nothing to do with whether those alleles made the organism more fit for survival or not. So for example, a mouse's nest could have been washed away in a flood and all of the babies died. And so those alleles are now removed from that population. In small populations, genetic drift can really drastically affect allele frequencies. You may find that what you're left with are a lot of harmful alleles, or it may be that the really rare advantageous alleles have been randomly lost. But even in large populations, genetic drift can influence frequencies. And if anything, they just reduce genetic variation. Population bottlenecks are one thing that can result from genetic drift, or can lead to, it's sort of like a type of genetic drift. If you have a population that's very diverse and large with lots of different alleles, and an environmental event results in just survival of a few individuals from that diverse large population. So let's say like a volcano wipes out most of your population and you just have these individuals left, then over time, that population that grows from the few that survived can look very different in allele frequency from the original population. And so we call that a population bottleneck. Another thing that can result from genetic drift is called the founder effect. And this comes from the result that if a few individuals leave the original population and form like, they colonize a new area, they populate a new area, then just by random chance, the individuals that left, the proportion of alleles in that population may be very different from the original population. So it's sort of the same situation as we saw with the founder effect. You started with a diverse, large population, and then the newly colonized area has only a few of the individuals that represent the original population. And so you lose a lot of variation. And of course, the allele frequencies here are quite different from here. So that's a source of evolutionary change. Non-random mating is a third process of evolutionary change. And this comes from the fact that when individuals within a population mate, it's not always random. For example, plants self-fertilize. So anytime an individual mates preferentially with another individual that has the same genotype, even if it's mating with itself through like self-fertilization, then you'll find that you'll have more homozygous genotypes in your population than you do heterozygous. And so over time, if the genes that are affected are ones that affect the reproductive success of the organism, then you may see a change in the allele frequency. You may not, but you definitely will see a change in the genotype frequency in cases where like self-fertilization happens. Another type of non-random mating is sexual selection, and of course Darwin talks about this in his book, but sexual selection is when individuals of one sex mate preferentially with individuals of the opposite sex. Like they prefer a certain type of individual, or an individual with a certain phenotype of the opposite sex. They don't just mate randomly. And then this way, like some really seemingly non-adaptive traits that really don't increase the chances of the organism's survival may make it more attractive to the opposite sex. So there's like a trade-off between survival and like whether or not you would attract predators or be able to avoid predators versus being able to attract mates. And so some really drastic changes in allele frequencies can happen because of that, because the females just prefer one type of mate over another. Okay. An example of this is the African long-tailed widow bird, and a picture of that is shown here. There was a hypothesis that the female widow birds preferred to mate with males that had really long tail feathers. So they did this experiment where they captured the males and they either artificially lengthened their tails, or they left them normal, they didn't mess with them, or they artificially shortened them by cutting some of the feathers off. And by artificially lengthening them, they like literally glued feathers onto the male's tail to make it longer. And then they looked at how many nests this male had with other females on average. And they found that the artificially lengthened male had the tail that was artificially elongated. Those individuals attracted 4 times more females than the males with the artificially shortened tails. And so these males are the ones that get to pass their traits on down to the most offspring. And so that trait persists in the population. Those alleles persist at a high frequency, even though they don't make the organism more fit for survival. Okay, so I think that is plenty for today, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.